In your hands, the steam rising gently. In your hands, the steam rising gently, the house hushed around you. Let the day slip away as we settle into a calm mystery together, one that asks for nothing more than your relaxed attention. If these gentle tales bring you a little peace before sleep, do consider subscribing for more comforting mysteries like this one. They arrive just when the world feels a touch too hurried. The story is a gentle, original Miss Marple mystery crafted to the exact specifications. Calm, slow-paced, no violence or drama, focused on quiet observation, human nature, and intellectual satisfaction. The title, Death on New Year's Night, is gradually unpacked chapter by chapter. The mystery revolves around a seemingly tragic death announced or occurring on New Year's night. But the death is metaphorical at first glance, then revealed as literal in an unexpected, peaceful way, with the title's true meaning emerging as a misunderstood phrase tied to a will, a clock, and a kind old gentleman's final wish. Chapter 1. The Quiet Beginning. In the little village of St. Mary, Mead, the opening days of any new year carried a special stillness, as though the whole countryside had decided quite mutually and without fuss to rest a while longer before the ordinary business of living began again. The holly wreaths had been taken down from front doors with care, their red berries saved in small bowls for the birds. The last crumbs of Christmas cake had been swept away, and the final mince pie shared between neighbors over a cup of tea, and even the church bells which had rung so joyfully at midnight on the 31st now seemed content to remain silent until Sunday. The lanes were quiet, the gardens bare but tidy, the sky a pale, thoughtful gray that promised neither rain nor sun, only continuation. Miss Jane Marple sat in her usual chair beside the sitting-room window, where the afternoon light of January the 2nd fell softly across her lap. She was knitting, a simple pattern of soft lavender wool that would become in time a warm shawl for the daughter of the new young curate. The needles moved with the same unhurried rhythm they had kept for more than 60 years. Click, pause, in a sound as familiar in that room as the ticking of the small mantel clock, or the faint creak of the house settling in the cold. She wore her second-best cardigan, the one with the pearl buttons, and a pair of fingerless mittens so that her hands stayed warm without losing dexterity. A pot of tea stood on the little table at her elbow. China tea, not too strong, with just the right amount of milk, and beside it rested a single digestive biscuit on a rose-patterned plate. Everything was as it should be. That morning the post had brought one small square envelope addressed in a hand she knew at once, old Mr. Horace Pendleton's. The ink was black, the letters formed with the deliberate care of someone who had learned penmanship in an age when such things mattered deeply. She had opened it with the butter knife, careful not to tear the flap more than necessary, and read the few lines inside. Dear Miss Marple, I should be most grateful if you would call upon me tomorrow evening at 8 o'clock. There is a small matter I wish to discuss. Yours sincerely, H. Pendleton. No more, no less. No hint of urgency, no flourish of explanation. Just the invitation, polite and precise as was everything Horace Pendleton ever did. Miss Marple had folded the note again, slipped it into the side pocket of her knitting bag, and returned to her stitches. Mr. Pendleton was 93, perhaps 94 now. One lost count so easily after 90. And though his body had grown thin and his steps slow, his mind remained as neat and orderly as the rows of delphiniums he had once tended behind his tall brick house at the very end of the lane. And he had lived alone since his wife Edith passed 12 winters ago. Yet he never gave the impression of loneliness. He had his routines, the morning walk, only to the gate now, but still every day the weather allowed, the newspaper delivered promptly at 7:15, tea at 4, and the winding of the grandfather clock in the hall precisely at 9 each evening. The clock was his pride, a tall, mahogany-cased piece with a mellow chime that could be heard faintly all the way to the vicarage on still nights. Miss Marple suspected the small matter would be something ceremonial. Perhaps he wished to share his traditional New Year reflections, a habit he had kept since the 1950s. Every January he would invite one or two old friends to sit by his fire, sip a thimbleful of sherry, and speak quietly of the year just past and the one newly arrived. He liked to mark time in this gentle way, as though each turning of the calendar deserved acknowledgement, however modest. She pictured him in his wing-backed chair, the firelight catching the silver of his watch chain, his voice low and measured as he spoke of small kindnesses remembered or small mistakes forgiven. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would disturb the peace of an evening. Only the ordinary comforts of long acquaintance, and yet... She paused in her knitting, the lavender wool suspended between her fingers. There had been something, just the faintest touch, about the handwriting. The letters were as firm as ever, no tremor visible even in the tails of the G or the cross of the T. But the spacing between the lines seemed a fraction wider than usual, and the signature placed a little lower on the page, as though the writer had paused longer before setting down his name. Nothing one could point to with certainty. Nothing alarming. Only a small breath of difference, like the way a room feels after someone has quietly left it. Miss Marple smiled at her own fancy and resumed her stitches. St. Mary Mead had taught her many things over the years, but one lesson above all. The ordinary was rarely quite as ordinary as it first appeared. People were creatures of habit, and when a habit changed, even by the width of a single letter, it often meant something human and understandable lay behind it. A small worry, perhaps, a memory stirred after many years. Or simply the gentle recognition common to those who had lived long that time was no longer unlimited. She glanced out the window, and beyond her garden hedge the lane lay empty, the bare branches of the lime trees making delicate patterns against the sky. A robin hopped along the top of the wall, head cocked, as though listening for worms beneath the frost-hard earth. Everything moved at its proper pace. Nothing hurried. She finished the row, counted the stitches to be sure, then set the knitting aside for a moment. The tea had cooled to the exact temperature she preferred. She lifted the cup, felt the warmth against her palms, and took a slow sip. Tomorrow evening she would put on her good wool coat, the one with the fur collar she had had since 1968, and walk the short distance to Mr. Pendleton's house. She would listen attentively, as she always did. She would ask gentle questions if questions seemed needed, and if no questions were needed, she would simply sit in companionable quiet, letting the fire crackle and the clock chime the quarter hours. For the moment, though, there was nothing to do but knit another row, watch the light fade across the garden, and allow the peaceful rhythm of the afternoon to carry on. The new year was only 2 days old, plenty of time for whatever small matter awaited. Miss Marple picked up her needles once more. Click, pause, click, pause. The lavender shawl grew slowly longer. Outside, the robin flew away. The village settled deeper into its winter hush, and somewhere at the end of the lane, in a tall brick house, an old gentleman waited patiently for 8 o'clock the following evening. His clock already wound, his fire laid, his few words chosen with care. Chapter 2. Something slightly unusual. The evening of January the 3rd arrived as quietly as one might expect in St. Mary Mead at that time of year. By 7:30, the last of the daylight had slipped away behind the church tower, leaving the village wrapped in a soft, velvety dark. Street lamps, only 4 along the main lane, cast gentle pools of amber light, each one just bright enough to guide a careful walker without disturbing the stars overhead. Miss Marple closed her front door behind her at 20 minutes to 8, pulling the collar of her good wool coat a little higher against the crisp air. She carried a small cloth bag containing her knitting, One never knew when a few rows might be useful. A clean handkerchief and the folded note from Mr. Pendleton, though she knew its contents by heart. And the walk to the tall brick house at the end of the lane took no more than 7 minutes at her usual unhurried pace. She passed the lighted windows of the vicarage where shadows moved behind the curtains. Likely Mrs. Price Ridley arranging cushions or the vicar searching for his spectacles. Further along, old Mrs. Dane's cottage showed only a single lamp in the upstairs window. She retired early these winter evenings. The lane itself was empty save for a tabby cat that paused on a low wall to watch her pass, its eyes reflecting green in the lamplight before it vanished into the shadows of a privet hedge. Mr. Pendleton's house stood a little apart from its neighbors, set back behind iron railings in a gravel drive that crunched softly underfoot. The front door was painted a deep bottle green, the brass knocker polished as always, and Miss Marple lifted it once, gentle not loud, and let it fall. Almost at once the door opened, and there was Mrs. Finch, the housekeeper, in her navy cardigan and neatly pinned apron. "Good evening, Miss Marple. Do come in out of the cold. He's expecting you." Mrs. Finch's voice was lower than usual, almost conspiratorial, though there was no one else to overhear. She took Miss Marple's coat and hung it on the mahogany stand in the hall, then led the way toward the drawing room. As they passed the grandfather clock, Miss Marple noticed it ticking steadily, the pendulum swinging with its familiar slow grace. The brass weights gleamed, the face showed the time as 7:58. Everything in its place. Mr. Pendleton was seated in his favorite wing-backed chair beside the fire. A small table stood at his right hand, bearing a decanter of sherry, 2 glasses, and a single folded sheet of notepaper. The fire had been built up thoughtfully, logs of apple wood giving off a faint, sweet smoke, and a reading lamp cast a warm circle of light across his knees. He looked much as he always did. Thin white hair brushed neatly, a dark cardigan buttoned to the throat, hands resting lightly on the arms of the chair. Only the slight pallor of his skin and the way his eyes seemed to rest a moment longer before focusing betrayed anything different. "Miss Marple," he said, rising with careful effort and offering his hand. "Thank you for coming. Please do sit." She settled into the chair opposite, accepting the small glass of sherry he poured with a steady hand. The liquid was pale gold, very dry, the way he liked it. "I hope I haven't inconvenienced you," he began. At once they were both seated. "It's only a small thing, but I felt it best to speak to someone who understands how these matters sometimes present themselves." Miss Marple inclined her head, saying nothing yet. She had learned long ago that silence often invited more than questions. Mr. Pendleton took a slow sip of his own sherry, then set the glass down with precision. "You will recall, I expect, that I have always been rather particular about time. The clock," he gestured toward the hall, "has never missed a chime in my lifetime, nor in my father's before me. I wound it myself this afternoon, as I have done every day since 1946. But last night, as the old year turned to the new, something rather different occurred." He paused, looking into the fire for a long moment. "At midnight precisely, when the chimes struck 12, I sat here alone, and the wireless was off. The house was quiet, and as the last note faded, I made up my mind. I decided it was time." Miss Marple's fingers rested lightly on the stem of her glass. "Time for what, Mr. Pendleton?" He turned his gaze to her, clear and calm. "Time to set everything in order. The small fears, the little unfinished thoughts one carries about for years. They seemed to weigh more heavily as the new year began. So I rose, went to my desk, and wrote this." He tapped the folded paper. "My will revised for the last time, and a short note to accompany it. I wrote the date, January the 1st, and then these words: When you read this, I shall have experienced death on New Year's night. The phrase settled into the room like a dropped petal, soft but impossible to ignore. Miss Marple took another small sip of sherry. I asked you to come, not because I am. I asked you to come, not because I am ill. Dr. Haydock called yesterday and found nothing amiss beyond the ordinary wear and tear of 93 years. No, I am quite well. But I have arranged things so that when the end does come, and it cannot be far off now, there will be no confusion, no distress for those left behind. The note explains it all. The death I spoke of was not the final one. Not yet. He leaned forward slightly. I have always believed that one should meet these things squarely without fuss. On New Year's night, the old year died, quite naturally and properly. With it, I let certain old worries die also, and they had been ticking away inside me like a second clock, you see. I wound down the last of them at midnight, listened to the chimes, and felt lighter. That was the death I meant. Miss Marple nodded slowly. It was a curious way of putting it, yet not so very strange when one considered the man. Horace Pendleton had spent a lifetime measuring hours, minutes, seconds. To speak of an inner clock winding down seemed almost poetic in its precision. Mrs. Finch appeared at the doorway then, carrying a small tray with 2 slices of seed cake on rose-patterned plates. "Thought you might like a bite, sir," she said. "And Miss Marple, too." Mr. Pendleton thanked her, and they ate in companionable quiet for a few minutes. The fire crackled softly. The clock in the hall struck the quarter hour with its deep, mellow note. When Mrs. Finch had withdrawn again, Mr. Pendleton spoke once more. "I have no wish to alarm anyone, but should anything happen sooner than expected, I wanted at least one person in the village to know the note was written in calm mind, not in fear. You have always had a way of seeing things clearly, Miss Marple. I trust your judgment." She set her plate aside and met his eyes. "I shall remember every word," she promised. He nodded, satisfied. "Then that is all. Thank you for listening." They spoke a little longer. Of the mild winter, of the new roses he hoped someone would plant in spring, of the pleasure of a well-ordered life. At 9:05, he glanced at his watch. "I must not keep you late," he said. "The nights are cold." Miss Marple rose, and he saw her to the door himself, moving slowly but steadily. Mrs. Finch helped her on with her coat. As she stepped onto the gravel, Mr. Pendleton called softly from the threshold. "Good night, Miss Marple, and thank you again." "Good night, Mr. Pendleton," she replied. "Sleep well." She walked home under the same clear stars, the air sharp against her cheeks. The phrase "death on New Year's night" turned quietly in her mind. Not alarming, not yet, but present, like the single off-beat note in an otherwise perfect chime. Back in her own sitting room, she hung her coat, poked the fire into fresh life, and sat for a while with her knitting untouched in her lap. Outside, the village slept. Inside, the small mantel clock ticked on. And somewhere at the end of the lane, in a tall brick house, an old gentleman listened to his grandfather clock strike the hour, smiled faintly, even prepared for whatever the new year might bring. Chapter 3. Gentle Observations. The days following Miss Marple's visit to Mr. Pendleton's house slipped by with the same quiet certainty as the turning of pages in an old, well-thumbed book. January the 4th dawned cold but clear. Frost traced delicate patterns on the window panes of St. Mary, Mead, and the village woke slowly, as though reluctant to disturb the peace that still lingered from the New Year's beginning. Miss Marple rose at her usual hour, drew back the curtains to let in the pale morning light, and prepared her breakfast. A boiled egg, 1 thin slice of toast with a scrape of butter, and a pot of tea kept warm under a knitted cozy. She ate at the small kitchen table, watching through the window as the milkman's float rattled past, in the bottles clinking softly in their crates. She did not hurry her thoughts about Mr. Pendleton. Instead, she let them settle naturally, the way one allows tea leaves to sink to the bottom of the cup before pouring. The phrase "death on New Year's night" remained in her mind, not as a puzzle demanding immediate solution, but as a small, smooth stone one turns over in the hand from time to time, feeling its shape and weight. There was no urgency. Mr. Pendleton had seemed quite well when she left him, his voice steady, his eyes calm. And yet the words had been chosen with such deliberate care. That alone was enough to make her notice things she might otherwise have passed over. On the morning of the 5th, she walked to the village shop for a packet of lavender sachets and a small jar of honey. Mrs. Price Ridley was there. The holidays had passed. How cold the holidays had passed. How cold the nights had become. And then the vicar's wife lowered her voice slightly. "I saw Dr. Haydock coming out of Mr. Pendleton's yesterday afternoon," she said. "Routine visit, I expect, but he looked rather thoughtful as he drove away. I asked him if everything was all right, and he only said as right as can be expected at 93. Then he added something curious. He's been talking about death on New Year's night, you know. Quite cheerfully, mind you. I wasn't sure what to make of it." Miss Marple nodded, her expression mild. "Old gentlemen sometimes speak poetically about these things," she murmured. "A way of putting the house in order, perhaps. Mrs. Price Ridley looked relieved. "Yes, that must be it. He's always been so orderly." Miss Marple paid for her purchases and walked home along the lane that skirted the churchyard. The gravestones stood silent under their dusting of frost, names worn soft by time. She paused for a moment at the lich gate, not out of melancholy, but because it was a place where one could think undisturbed. Horace Pendleton had often said he wished to be buried here, close to Edith, with nothing more than a simple headstone and the inscription they had agreed upon years ago. At rest. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would draw attention. That afternoon she called at the vicarage with a small pot of her own quince jelly as a thank you for the Christmas flowers the vicar had sent round. The vicar himself answered the door, his spectacles slightly askew, a book of parish registers open on the hall table. "Ah, Miss Marple. Do come in. I was just thinking of you." He led her to the sitting room where a small fire burned. Mrs. Price Ridley was out visiting parishioners, so they had the room to themselves. "I saw Mr. Pendleton on the 3rd, the vicar said after they were seated. He asked me to call again this morning, said he wanted me to witness his signature on a codicil to his will. Very straightforward, very calm. He told me he'd settled everything on New Year's night. The old year died peacefully, he said, and so did a good many of my old worries." Then he smiled, that small, contented smile of his, and added, "Death on New Year's night was kinder than I expected." The vicar shook his head gently. "I took it as a figure of speech. He's always had a philosophical turn. I'd asked only one question. Did he seem at all like a man who had been to the front?" Miss Marple accepted a cup of tea and listened without interrupting. When the vicar had finished, she asked only one question. "Did he seem at all unwell?" "Not in the least," the vicar replied. "His hand was steady when he signed, his color was good. He even joked about hoping the new curate would keep the church clock wound properly after he was gone." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "He has always been fond of punctuality." She left the vicarage a little before 4, the light already fading. On her way home, she passed Mrs. Finch sweeping the front path of Mr. Pendleton's house. The housekeeper paused, leaning on her broom. "He's been sitting by the fire all afternoon, miss," she said, "listening to the clock chime. Every hour, every quarter. He just nods to himself. Ain't as though it's telling him something only he can hear. Said last night, "It's nice to know exactly when the old year ended and the new one began. 12 clear chimes, nothing left hanging." Miss Marple thanked her and continued on. That evening, as she sat knitting in her own sitting room, she found herself counting the chimes of her own small mantel clock. 9 o'clock, 10, 11. Each note fell into the quiet house like a pebble into still water, sending out gentle ripples of sound. She imagined Mr. Pendleton in his wing-backed chair, doing the same, listening, nodding, letting the rhythm reassure him that time was still moving forward in its proper order. On the 6th of January, she met Dr. Haydock in the lane near the post office. He touched his hat politely. "Morning, Miss Marple. Bitter wind today." "Indeed," she agreed. "How is Mr. Pendleton?" The doctor considered for a moment. "Physically, much the same. Heart steady, lungs clear, blood pressure as good as one could hope. But he's reflective. Spoke again about New Year's night. Said he'd arranged for death on New Year's night, and felt all the better for it. I asked if he meant anything specific, and he only smiled and said, 'The best kind of death, doctor, the kind you choose for yourself, a little at a time.' I think he was talking about letting go of anxiety. Old people do that sometimes, make peace with the past before the body quite catches up." Miss Marple thanked him and walked on, her mind turning the various fragments she had gathered. No one seemed alarmed. No one saw cause for concern. And yet each person had noticed the same phrase, the same quiet insistence on that particular night. And it was as though Mr. Pendleton had planted a small signpost in the conversation, pointing towards something he wished to be understood. Later, perhaps, when the time was right. That evening she sat by her fire with her knitting in her lap, the lavender shawl now long enough to drape across her knees. Outside, the village lights winked out one by one. The church clock struck the hour with its deep, familiar tone. Somewhere at the end of the lane, she knew another clock was chiming in answer. Miss Marple did not worry. She observed. She listened. She waited. And in St. Mary Mead, where small things so often carried the seeds of larger understanding, that was usually enough. So Chapter 4, A Calm Contradiction. The morning of January the 7th broke with a thin layer of frost that made every twig and blade of grass sparkle faintly under the weak winter sun. In St. Mary Mead, the village stirred slowly. Chimneys sent up pale threads of smoke, doors opened to let out the night's chill, and the milk bottles on doorsteps wore small caps of ice. Miss Marple woke at her usual time, drew the curtains, and stood for a moment looking out at her garden. The rose bushes, pruned back hard for winter, stood patient and bare. She dressed in her warmest skirt and cardigan, made her tea, and carried the tray to the sitting room where the fire was already laid the night before and now crackled softly into life. She had not expected news quite so soon. It came by way of young Tommy Pierce, the baker's boy, who knocked at her door just after 9 o'clock with a small paper bag of fresh rolls and a face full of the kind of solemn importance only a 14-year-old can carry without embarrassment. "Miss Marple, ma'am," he said, shifting from one foot to the other. "Mrs. Finch asked me to tell you. Mr. Pendleton, he passed away in the night. Peaceful, she says. Just slipped away in his sleep. Dr. Haydock's been and gone already. Natural causes, he told her. Old age." Miss Marple received the news without exclamation. She thanked Tommy quietly, gave him 6pence for his trouble, and closed the door. For several minutes she stood in the hall, one hand resting lightly on the newel post, letting the information settle. There was no shock, only a gentle, inevitable sadness, the kind that comes when a long-expected guest finally departs. 93 years was a good span. Mr. Pendleton had lived fully, quietly, and with dignity. Yet the timing, The very fact that it had come now, so soon after his careful words, gave the moment a small, thoughtful weight. She telephoned Mrs. Finch at once. The housekeeper's voice was steady, though softer than usual. "He went just before dawn, miss. I looked in at 5:30, as I always do, and he was still and peaceful. No struggle, no pain. The doctor said his heart simply stopped, gentle as anything. He'd left everything written down, where to find the will, what to do about the funeral, even instructions for the flowers. White chrysanthemums, nothing else." Miss Marple asked if there was anything she could do. "Just come to the house later if you would," Mrs. Finch replied. "He always said you understood these things better than most. There'll be tea after the undertakers have been. Nothing formal, just a few of us who knew him." Miss Marple promised she would come. The rest of the morning passed in small, ordinary tasks. A letter to her nephew Raymond, a few rows of knitting, a walk around the garden to check that the frost had not split any of the clay pots. She moved deliberately, giving her thoughts time to arrange themselves. The phrase "death on New Year's night" returned to her mind, not as something alarming now, but as something that no longer quite matched the simple facts. Mr. Pendleton had died in the early hours of the 7th of January. New Year's night, midnight between the 31st and the 1st, had been 6 full days earlier. He had lived through those 6 days, spoken to his friends, to the tall brick house at 3 o'clock. To the tall brick house at 3 o'clock that afternoon, her good black coat buttoned against the cold, a small bunch of winter jasmine from her own garden tied with ribbon. Mrs. Finch opened the door, eyes a little red but composed. "Thank you for coming, miss. The vicar's here already, and Dr. Haydock looked in again to sign the certificate. Everything's quite orderly, just as he wanted." They went into the drawing room. The fire was low but burning steadily. The grandfather clock stood in the hall beyond, its pendulum still, its face showing 20 past 3. No ticking, no chime. The silence was noticeable after so many years of steady sound. Miss Marple placed the jasmine in a small vase on the mantelpiece and sat in the chair she had occupied only 4 nights earlier. Mrs. Finch brought tea on a tray, thin slices of bread and butter, a seed cake, everything simple and correct. "He left a note for you," Mrs. Finch said, handing her an envelope. "It was with the will. He wrote it on the 1st after you'd gone." Miss Marple opened it carefully. "My dear Miss Marple, if you are reading this, the body has followed where the mind already went. Do not grieve overmuch. On New Year's night, as the clock struck 12, I let the last of my burdens die. The worries, the small regrets, the fear of being a trouble. They ended then. What remained was only peace. The rest is mere formality, with gratitude, Horace Pendleton." She read it twice, and then folded it neatly and placed it in her handbag. The vicar joined them, murmuring a few words of comfort. They spoke quietly of arrangements. The funeral would be simple on the 10th in the churchyard beside Edith. No flowers except the chrysanthemums. No long eulogy, just a short reading from the Psalms. After the vicar had left, Mrs. Finch sat down opposite Miss Marple and poured herself a second cup. "He kept saying it, miss, right up to the last evening. Death on New Year's night was the kindest thing. I thought at first he was wandering, but he was clear as day. Yet here we are 6 days later, and he only just passed. Why name the night so exactly when he lived on?" Miss Marple stirred her tea slowly. "It is a small contradiction," she agreed. "But contradictions, when they are calm and deliberate, I often point the way to something quite simple, once one sees it from the right angle." Mrs. Finch looked at her hopefully. "He wound the clock himself on the afternoon of the 3rd, she said. The very day you came. He said it must chime properly that night, and every night after until, well, until it didn't need to anymore. Then he told me not to wind it again after he was gone. Let it rest, he said. Its work is done. Miss Marple glanced toward the silent clock in the hall. Its work, she repeated softly. They sat in quiet for a while, the fire settling into embers. Outside, the short winter afternoon faded toward dusk. The village lights began to appear one by one along the lane. Miss Marple finished her tea, thanked Mrs. Finch, and rose to go. I shall come again after the funeral, she said. There may be one or two small things to settle. Mrs. Finch saw her to the door. As Miss Marple stepped onto the gravel, she paused and looked back at the tall brick house. The windows glowed softly against the gathering dark. The clock inside would never chime again. 6 days after New Year's night, the man who had wound it so carefully had followed his own inner rhythm to its close. Yet the contradiction remained, gentle but persistent. He had spoken of a death that had happened 6 days before the body finally rested. Miss Marple walked home under the first stars, her footsteps slow and even on the frosty path. She did not hurry her thoughts. In time, she knew the pieces would fit together, not with a dramatic snap, but with the quiet click of a well-made lock turning at last. For now, she let the night deepen around her, be calm and thoughtful. Chapter 5. A Detail Revisited. The funeral of Horace Pendleton took place on the morning of January the 10th, under a sky the color of old pewter. It was a small gathering, as he had wished. The vicar and his wife, Dr. Haydock, Mrs. Finch, 2 distant cousins who had traveled from Cheltenham, Miss Marple, and a handful of neighbors who had known him for decades. No one wept loudly. The service was conducted with the same quiet dignity the old gentleman had always shown. The vicar read the 23rd Psalm in his gentle, measured voice, and when the simple oak coffin was lowered into the ground beside Edith's resting place, a few white chrysanthemums were placed on the lid before the earth began to fall. The headstone, already ordered months earlier, would be added later. Plain gray marble, in the inscription brief and final. Afterward, those closest to him returned to the tall brick house for tea. The drawing room felt larger without Mr. Pendleton in his chair, yet everything else remained exactly as he had left it. The fire lay just so, the small tables polished, the decanter of sherry still on the sideboard with 2 clean glasses waiting beside it. Mrs. Finch moved about with calm efficiency, pouring tea, passing plates of seed cake and thin sandwiches, accepting the murmured condolences with a small nod and a quiet, "Thank you, he would have appreciated that." Miss Marple sat near the window, her black gloves folded in her lap, watching the others with her usual gentle attentiveness. She had not come to grieve in any demonstrative way. She had come to listen, to observe, and then perhaps to understand the small contradiction that still lingered in her mind, like the last note of a chime that had already faded. When the cousins had departed and the vicar had returned to the parish, only Mrs. Finch, Dr. Haydock, and Miss Marple remained. The housekeeper cleared the tea things, then returned with a small wooden box that Mr. Pendleton had kept on the top shelf of his desk. "He said you might wish to see this, miss," she told Miss Marple. "After the funeral. He wrote your name on the lid." The box was plain mahogany, no lock, only a small brass catch. Inside lay the folded note Miss Marple had already read, together with the revised will in its envelope and 1 additional sheet of paper, thicker, cream-colored, dated January the 1st in the same careful hand. Miss Marple unfolded it slowly. "My dear friends, when you read this, I shall have experienced death on New Year's night. Do not grieve. It was the kindest death of all, the death of the old year, and of my last worries. At midnight, as the clock struck 12, I wound it one final time. I listened to each chime, clear and complete, and with every note I let go of something small that had weighed on me. The fear that I might linger too long and become a burden, the quiet regret over words unspoken to Edith in her last years, the little anxieties about money, about the house, about being forgotten. They died then quite peacefully in the space between the 11th chime and the 12th. What followed was only calm. I revised my will that same night, telephoned my solicitor at 1:30. He was kind enough to take the call, and slept better than I have in years. And the grandfather clock in the hall is to remain unwound forever after my death. Its silence will mark the true end of my time here. Do not mistake the later passing of the body for the real departure. That happened earlier on the night the year turned. Remember me with a smile. Horace Pendleton. Miss Marple read the words once, then again, more slowly. She looked up at the silent grandfather clock standing in the hall beyond the open doorway. Its face was still, the hands fixed at 12 minutes past 12. The exact moment, she realized, when Mr. Pendleton must have stopped it after that final winding on New Year's night. No one had touched it since. Mrs. Finch watched her quietly. "He did stop it himself," she said, "on the morning of the 1st. Came down at 7:30, opened the door, took out the key, in and let the weights down gently. Said, 'That's enough now. No need to keep it going just for show.' I thought it odd. He'd never let it run down before, but he was so calm about it. Smiled at me and said, 'The new year deserves a fresh start. Even the clock can rest.' Dr. Haydock, who had been standing by the fire, turned. 'So that's what he meant,' he murmured, 'when he spoke to me of death on New Year's night. I assumed it was a metaphor for accepting his own mortality, but he was quite literal, only not about the body.' Miss Marple folded the paper carefully and replaced it in the box. 'Of course,' she said softly. 'The clock.' She rose and walked to the doorway, looking up at the tall mahogany case. The glass door was slightly ajar. Inside, the pendulum hung motionless. She reached out and touched the brass weights. Cold, still, and no longer swaying. "He wound it one last time on New Year's night," she continued, "as a deliberate ceremony. 12 chimes to mark the death of the old year, and the death of everything inside him that had been ticking away like worry or regret. Then he let it run down naturally over the next few hours. By morning it was silent, and so was he, in the ways that mattered most." Mrs. Finch gave a small, surprised breath. Then all those days afterward, when he sat listening to the wireless, talking about the roses for spring, signing papers, he was already at peace. "Exactly so," Miss Marple replied. "The body continued because bodies do until they cannot. But the man who had carried burdens for 93 years had laid them down at midnight on the 31st. That was the death he chose to announce so precisely. Not dramatic, not frightening, just accurate." Dr. Haydock nodded slowly. "He even told me the day before he passed that he felt lighter than he had in years. I put it down to good spirits, but he was speaking the literal truth." Miss Marple returned to her chair. The room felt quieter now, not emptier but clearer, as though a small fog had lifted. "The note makes complete sense now," she said. "He was never predicting his bodily death on that night. He was describing an inner one, and he wanted us to understand the difference, so there would be no unnecessary sorrow when the end came later." Mrs. Finch looked toward the silent clock. "Shall we leave it as it is, then? Unwound, as he asked?" "Yes," Miss Marple answered gently. "Let it rest. Its chimes marked the passing of something far more important than hours. They sat together a little longer, speaking of small memories. Mr. Pendleton's love of punctuality, his quiet kindness, the way he had always remembered everyone's birthday with a card and a short note. No tears, only the gentle warmth of recollection. When Miss Marple rose to leave, the early dusk was already gathering outside. She thanked Mrs. Finch, shook Dr. Haydock's hand, and stepped onto the gravel drive. As she walked home along the lane, the village lights began to appear, warm squares in cottage windows, the glow of the lampposts. The church clock struck the quarter hour, its deep tone carrying clearly through the cold air. Miss Marple paused for a moment, listening. Somewhere, she thought, Horace Pendleton had found his own perfect silence, and in that silence he had known peace. The contradiction had resolved itself not with surprise or drama, but with the quiet satisfaction of seeing the whole picture at last. Chapter 6. Quiet Explanation. The afternoon of January the 12th found Miss Marple in her own small sitting room, the fire burning low and steady, the curtains half drawn against the pale winter light. She had invited 3 people to tea: Mrs. Finch, Dr. Haydock, and the vicar. Not a formal gathering, no announcements, no ceremony, only a quiet hour when the village had settled back into its rhythm and the first sharp edge of morning had softened. The lavender shawl she had been knitting lay folded over the arm of her chair, nearly complete now. She had added a few more rows that morning while her thoughts arranged themselves like pieces on a familiar board. The guests arrived within minutes of one another. Mrs. Finch carried a small tin of shortbread she had baked the day before. Mr. Pendleton always liked them plain, she said softly as she set it on the table. Dr. Haydock brought nothing but his calm presence. The vicar arrived with a faint scent of wood smoke on his coat and a gentle smile. Miss Marple poured tea from her best china pot, 4 cups, milk first for Mrs. Finch and the vicar, lemon for the doctor, and passed round the shortbread. No one spoke of the weather or the news. They simply sat, letting the warmth of the room ease them into conversation. It was Mrs. Finch who broke the quiet first. "I keep thinking about that note," she said, turning her cup slowly in her hands. "All those days he was still here, sitting by the fire, talking about the garden, yet asking after the new baby at the post office, and yet he wrote as though he'd already died on New Year's night. I understand it now, a little, but I'd like to hear it said plainly. It feels kinder that way." Miss Marple nodded, setting her own cup down with care. "Of course," she replied, "there is no need for mystery when the truth is so gentle. Let me explain it as I believe Mr. Pendleton meant us to understand it." She paused for a moment, gathering her thoughts the way one gathers a skein of wool before beginning a new row. Horace Pendleton was, above all things, a man who valued precision. He measured his days not only by the clock in his hall, but by the small inner rhythms of conscience and feeling. For many years, especially since Edith's passing, he had carried a number of quiet burdens, not great sins or dramatic sorrows, do you understand, but the ordinary accumulations of a long life, the worry that he might outlive his usefulness and become a trouble to others, the small, nagging regret over conversations left unfinished with his wife, the fear so common in old age that one's name would fade too quickly from memory. These things ticked away inside him like a second clock, steady and persistent, marking time even when the outer world was still. She glanced toward her own small mantel clock, which ticked softly in the background. On New Year's night, as the grandfather clock in his hall began to strike 12, something shifted. The old year was ending, not with fanfare, but with the same calm inevitability as every year before it. 12 clear chimes, each one distinct, each one final. As he listened, and he decided quite deliberately to let those inner burdens die with the old year. He did not wait for illness or accident to force the issue. He chose the moment himself. Dr. Haydock leaned forward slightly. He spoke to me of feeling lighter in those last days. I thought it was merely contentment. It was more than that, Miss Marple continued. It was release. That night, after the chimes had finished, he went to his desk. He revised his will, not out of haste or fear, but out of clarity. He telephoned his solicitor at an hour when most people would have hesitated, and the solicitor, knowing the man, listened without protest. He wrote the note we have all read, dating it carefully, January the 1st. And then he wound the grandfather clock one final time. It is a kind of ceremony, a last act of care for something that had served him faithfully for nearly a century. After that, he let it run down naturally. By morning it was silent. And so, in the ways that mattered most to him, was the part of himself that had been weighed down for so long. Mrs. Finch gave a small sigh, not of sorrow, but of recognition. So when he said, "Death on New Year's night," he meant the death he chose, Miss Marple finished gently. The death of worry, of regret, of the fear of being forgotten or burdensome. That inner clock stopped ticking at midnight on the 31st. What followed, those 6 additional days, was only the body continuing its own slow course. He ate his meals, he spoke with friends, he listened to the wireless in the evenings. He was peaceful because the struggle inside him had already ended. And when the body finally rested in the early hours of the 7th, it was not a sudden departure. It was simply the last natural step. The vicar set his cup aside. He told me, when I witnessed the codicil, that he had settled everything on New Year's night. I took it as a figure of speech, but he was speaking with perfect literalness. Only the literal referred to something deeper than the physical. Exactly, Miss Marple said. And that is why he left the instructions so clear, the clock to remain unwound forever. Its silence was not an accident or an oversight. It was the marker he chose, the visible sign of the inner silence he had achieved. He did not want it restarted, polished, or maintained as a curiosity. He wanted it to stand as it was when the last chime faded, at rest. A quiet fell over the room. Explanation had been given without explanation, had been given without flourish, without drama. Only the calm logic of a life well observed and well understood. Mrs. Finch looked up at last. "It makes the days after New Year's night feel different now," she said. "Not empty, but complete." He was already at peace when he spoke to us. We were talking to a man who had finished his own story and was simply waiting politely for the book to close. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Yes." And he closed it with such courtesy. No demands, no bitterness, only order and kindness and a wish that we should not grieve more than was natural. Dr. Haydock nodded. In medicine, one sees many kinds of passing. Some fight to the last breath, on some slip away in confusion. Very few arrange their departure so neatly, and with such consideration for those left behind. The vicar reached for another piece of shortbread. "He always did like things tidy," he murmured almost to himself. They sat on a little longer, speaking now of smaller memories. The way Mr. Pendleton had once mended the church gate without being asked, the Christmas card he sent every year with the same careful handwriting, the quiet pleasure he took in watching the seasons turn in his garden. No one hurried. The tea cooled in the pot. The fire burned down to embers. When at last the guests rose to leave, the room felt lighter, not emptied, but settled. Miss Marple saw them to the door one by one. Mrs. Finch lingered longest. "Thank you," she said simply, "for saying it plainly, and it helps. Miss Marple touched her arm gently. He would have wanted that. When the house was quiet again, Miss Marple returned to her chair, picked up her knitting, and resumed the lavender shawl. The needles moved in their familiar rhythm. Click, pause, click, pause. Outside, the short winter day drew toward its close. Somewhere at the end of the lane, a tall grandfather clock stood silent, its work done. And in that silence, everything had been explained. Not with fanfare, but with the gentle certainty of truth quietly spoken. Chapter 7. Peaceful Resolution. The days after the quiet explanation in Miss Marple's sitting room passed with the gentle inevitability of winter turning slowly toward spring. In St. Mary Mead, the frost began to loosen its hold. Small green shoots appeared at the base of the rose bushes, tentative but certain, and the afternoons grew fractionally longer. The village resumed its familiar rhythm. The postman's whistle along the lane, the chime of the church clock marking the hours, children's voices drifting from the schoolyard at playtime. Horace Pendleton's tall brick house stood with its windows shuttered for a season, waiting for new occupants who would respect its memories without erasing them. Miss Marple continued her daily routines as though nothing had changed, and in the deepest sense, nothing had. She finished the lavender shawl on the morning of January the 15th, folded it neatly with tissue paper, and delivered it to the young curate's wife with a small card. For the cold evenings ahead, with kind regards, J. Marple. The young woman accepted it with tears in her eyes, not for sorrow, but for the simple kindness that had prompted it. On the 20th of the month, Mrs. Finch came to call. She brought a small parcel wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. The last of Mr. Pendleton's seed cake, baked before Christmas and carefully stored. He always saved a piece for visitors, she said, setting it on the kitchen table. Thought you might like it. They sat together over tea, speaking not of loss but of small, vivid recollections. The way he had once spent an entire afternoon teaching the village boys to wind a pocket watch without scratching the case. The Christmas when he had quietly paid for the church flowers so the altar would not be bare. The evenings when he would stand at his gate watching the sunset paint the sky rose and gold and remark that time was a gift best appreciated in stillness. Mrs. Finch looked toward the window. The house is let now, she said. A quiet couple from the next county. They've agreed to leave the grandfather clock exactly as it is, unwound, silent. They even said they liked the idea. A clock at rest, the gentleman called it. A reminder that some things are finished properly. Miss Marple smiled faintly. A very fitting tribute. When Mrs. Finch had gone, Miss Marple walked the short distance to the churchyard. The new grave was still bare of grass, but the white chrysanthemums had been replaced with fresh ones. Someone had tended it daily. She stood for a moment beside the simple headstone, reading the inscription once more. Horace Pendleton, 1832 to 1925, at rest beside his Edith. No grand epitaph, no verse. Only the plain fact of a life completed and the quiet promise of reunion. She placed a single sprig of winter jasmine from her garden at the foot of the stone, then turned back along the path. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of wood smoke and damp earth. Somewhere a robin sang, a small bright note against the hush of the afternoon. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple drew the curtains against the early dusk, lit the lamp on her writing table, and opened her knitting bag. A new project waited. Soft gray wool for a pair of mittens intended for the postman's youngest daughter, who had outgrown her old ones. She cast on the stitches with deliberate care, the needles moving in their familiar cadence. Click, pause, click, pause. As she worked, her thoughts returned, not to the mystery that had once seemed to hang in the air, but to the gentle resolution it had revealed. Horace Pendleton had not died twice, nor had he spoken in riddles for effect. He had simply chosen to mark a moment of inner completion with the same precision he had brought to every other part of his life. The death on New Year's night had been real, the death of fear, of regret, of the small, persistent ticking of worry that had accompanied him for so many years. When that inner clock stopped, peace had entered fully. The body's quiet passing 6 days later had been merely the final courteous closing of the door. There was comfort in that clarity. No violence had marred the story. No sudden tragedy had shattered the village's calm. Only an old gentleman who, sensing his time drawing near, had arranged his departure with thoughtfulness and grace, leaving behind not confusion or sorrow but understanding and the memory of a life lived in order. Outside, and Miss Marple listened until the last echo. Miss Marple listened until the last echo faded, then resumed her knitting. Later, when the fire had burned low and the house was quiet, she rose to draw the curtains fully. Through the gap, she caught sight of the lane stretching toward the tall brick house at its end. The windows there were dark now, but not empty, only resting like the clock inside. In spring, the new owners would open them again, let light and voices fill the rooms. Perhaps plant roses where Mr. Pendleton had once planned them. Life would continue, unhurried, carrying forward the small kindnesses he had left behind. Miss Marple turned from the window, banked the fire for the night, and climbed the narrow stairs to her bedroom. She set her spectacles on the bedside table, folded her cardigan over the chair, and slipped beneath the eiderdown. The room was warm, the darkness soft. She closed her eyes and let her breathing slow. In St. Mary Mead, order had been restored, not through dramatic revelation, but through the patient accumulation of small truths. A phrase once puzzling had become perfectly clear. A life once lived had ended in the way its owner had chosen, peacefully, precisely, and with consideration for those who remained. The village slept, the stars turned overhead, and somewhere in the silence between one chime and the next that would never come, Horace Pendleton rested, his worries long since dead on New Year's night, his peace complete. Miss Marple drifted toward sleep, and the rhythm of her own quiet thoughts matching the gentle rise and fall of her breath. Tomorrow would bring its own small tasks, a letter to write, a walk to take, another row of knitting, all in good time. For now, the night was kind. Good night. Chapter 8. A gentle epilogue. Months passed in St. Mary Mead with the slow, unhurried grace that only English villages seem to possess in their deepest nature. By the middle of March, the worst of the winter had retreated. Daffodils pushed through the damp earth in bright yellow clusters along the lane, and the lime trees began to show the first faint haze of green. The air carried the clean, sharp scent of new growth mixed with wood smoke from cottage fires still lit in the early mornings. Miss Marple noticed these small changes as she walked each day, never far, never fast, on but far enough to keep her joints supple and her mind gently occupied. She wore her second-best coat now, the wool one with the small velvet collar, and carried a light basket for whatever she might find useful. A sprig of early blossom for the mantelpiece, a handful of herbs from her own patch, or simply the pleasure of fresh air on her face. The tall brick house at the end of the lane had new curtains at the windows, soft cream linen that caught the light in the afternoons. The new owners, Mr. and Mrs. Langford, were quiet people in their late 50s. He had been a schoolmaster before retirement. She painted watercolors of gardens and churchyards. They had moved in at the beginning of February, bringing with them only what they needed and a deep respect for what had come before. Miss Marple had called once, each room now theirs, drinking tea from the same room, now theirs. Drinking tea from the same rose-patterned cups Mr. Pendleton had used. The grandfather clock stood exactly where it always had, its face still, its pendulum motionless at 12 minutes past 12. "We've left it as it is," Mrs. Langford said, glancing toward the hall. "It feels right. A clock that has finished its work deserves to rest." Miss Marple had nodded. He would have approved. They spoke a little about the house's former owner, not as gossip, but as gentle acknowledgement. Mr. Langford mentioned that the solicitor had passed on Mr. Pendleton's wish about the clock. They had both read the note and understood its meaning. "It's not merely silent," he said. "It's at peace. There's a difference." Miss Marple had smiled at that. She liked people who noticed such distinctions. On a mild afternoon in late April, she walked again to the churchyard. The grass over Horace Pendleton's grave had begun to knit itself together, soft and even now. Someone, likely Mrs. Finch before she moved to her sister's in Taunton, had planted small clumps of forget-me-nots around the base of the headstone. The blue flowers nodded in the breeze, modest and enduring. Miss Marple stood for a while, hands folded, letting the quiet settle around her. No long prayers, no elaborate thoughts, just the simple recognition that a good life had ended well, and that the village was a fraction poorer for its absence, yet richer for its memory. And as she turned to leave, she noticed young Tommy Pierce, the same baker's boy who had brought the news back in January, sitting on the low wall near the lich gate. He was whittling a small piece of wood with a pocket knife, shaping what looked to be a whistle. "Afternoon, miss," he said, touching his cap. "Afternoon, Tommy, what are you making?" "A whistle for my little sister. She keeps asking for one." "Thought I'd try." Miss Marple watched him work for a moment. His hands were careful, patient, qualities not always common in 14-year-olds. "Mr. Pendleton used to make whistles too," she said quietly. "Not often, but when the village children asked nicely. He had a way with small things." Tommy looked up. "Did he?" "I never knew that." "He did many quiet kindnesses," she replied, "and most of them went unnoticed until long afterward." Tommy nodded slowly, then returned to his carving. "I reckon that's the best kind." Miss Marple continued home along the lane. The sun was warm on her back now, the kind of warmth that promised summer without hurry. At her own gate, she paused to deadhead a few early tulips, then went inside to the sitting room where the fire was laid but not yet lit. She took up her knitting once more, a pair of socks now, plain gray wool for the postman whose birthday was approaching. The needles moved in their familiar rhythm, steady and soothing. Outside, a blackbird sang from the top of the apple tree, clear notes falling into the afternoon quiet. In time, the whole story of death on New Year's night became part of the village's gentle lore, not a dark tale, but a comforting one. People spoke of it occasionally, usually in winter when the evenings were long and the fires bright. "They say old Mr. Pendleton died twice," someone might remark over tea at the vicarage. "Once on New Year's night when he let his worries go, and then properly a few days later." And another would nod. "He arranged it neatly. No fuss, just like him." Miss Marple never corrected these small retellings. She only smiled and added, if the moment felt right, "He chose his own ending. Not many have that privilege." Years later, though not so very many, the lavender shawl she had finished that January found its way to a great niece in the north, who wore it on cold evenings and thought fondly of the great aunt she had never met. The gray socks warmed the postman through another winter, and the forget-me-nots spread a little farther each spring around the headstone. And the grandfather clock in the tall brick house remained silent, a quiet monument to a man who had known exactly when and how to let go. Miss Marple lived on in her cottage for several more years, knitting, observing, offering tea and gentle wisdom to whoever needed it. She never sought the spotlight. She never needed to. Her satisfaction came from the small, daily restoration of order, in gardens, in conversations, in the hearts of those around her. And so the title that had once seemed puzzling, Death on New Year's Night, settled at last into perfect clarity. It was never about tragedy, it was about choice, about peace, about the kindness of ending one chapter cleanly so another could begin without shadow. On a quiet evening, much like the one on which our story opened, Miss Marple sat by her window knitting a final row, watching the light fade across the garden. The church clock struck the hour, its deep tone carrying across the village. Somewhere, far off, another clock might have answered once, but not any more. She smiled to herself, folded her work, and turned toward the fire. Everything was in its place. The village slept. Chapter 9. The last stitch time in St. Mary Mead never hurried, but it did move forward, quietly, steadily, like the slow turning of pages in a book one reads only before sleep. By the summer of 1926, the village had fully absorbed the small, gentle story of Horace Pendleton. Children who had once run past his gate now walked more slowly, and sometimes pausing to look at the tall brick house with its cream curtains and the silent clock visible through the hall window if one stood at just the right angle. Adults mentioned him less often, but when they did, the tone was always fond, almost affectionate, the way one speaks of an old clock that finally stopped but had never once failed anyone. Miss Marple, now in her later 70s, continued much as before. Her days were filled with the same small ceremonies. Morning tea by the window, a short walk to the shop or the churchyard, afternoon knitting in the sitting room with the wireless turned low. Her hands, though a little slower, remained sure. She had begun a new project in early May, a fine white baby blanket in shell stitch, intended for the first child of the young couple who had taken over the draper's shop. The wool was soft as a cloud, the pattern intricate but soothing to work. Each evening she added 10 rows, no more, no less, counting them carefully under the lamplight. One warm July afternoon she received an unexpected visitor. Mrs. Langford from the tall brick house appeared at the garden gate carrying a small wicker basket covered with a checked cloth. Miss Marple, who had been deadheading the lavender border, straightened and waved her in. "Do come through to the back," she called. "I've just made lemonade." They settled under the apple tree on 2 old wicker chairs that creaked companionably. Mrs. Langford lifted the cloth from the basket to reveal a plate of fresh scones, clotted cream, and a small jar of strawberry jam. "My husband made the scones," she said with a smile. "He's taken up baking since we retired, and these are his best yet." Miss Marple accepted one gratefully. They ate in comfortable silence for a few minutes, listening to the hum of bees among the lavender and the distant laughter of children playing cricket on the green. "I wanted to show you something," Mrs. Langford said at last. She reached into the basket again and drew out a slim notebook bound in dark green leather. "We found it behind a drawer in the study when we were sorting papers last month. It had your name on the first page, for Miss Marple should she ever wish to read it. We thought it best to bring it to you." Miss Marple opened the notebook with care. The handwriting was immediately recognizable, Horace Pendleton's, neat and unhurried. The pages contained short-dated entries beginning in the autumn of 1924 and continuing almost daily until December 31st, 1925. And they were not a diary in the usual sense. No great events, no confessions. Simply observations, small decisions, moments of quiet gratitude. October 14th, 1924. Walked to the gate today. Sky very clear. Remembered Edith saying the stars look closer in autumn. Still true. November 3rd. Mrs. Finch made treacle tart. Too sweet, but ate 2 pieces to please her. Kindness sometimes requires small sacrifices. December 25th, 1924. Quiet Christmas. Vicar brought mince pies, listened to carols on the wireless, felt Edith near. The entries grew shorter as 1925 advanced, but never less precise. December 30th, 1925. Tomorrow the year turns. Have decided to let the old worries go with it. Revised will this afternoon. Solicitor very understanding. Clock to be wound once more at midnight, last time. Then silence. December 31st, 1925. Midnight. 12 chimes, each one perfect. With the last note released everything. Fear of lingering, regret over small silences with Edith, anxiety about being forgotten. All gone. Body continues for now, but the real me finished tonight. Peaceful. Very peaceful. We'll leave this book where it may be found, for whoever cares to understand. The final entry was dated January 6th, 1926, only hours before he passed. 6 more days of ordinary living. Tea with the vicar, talked of roses, listened to the wireless until 9. No ticking inside anymore, only quiet. Good night. Miss Marple closed the notebook gently and rested her hands on the cover. Thank you, she said. This is exactly what he would have wanted someone to see. Mrs. Langford nodded. We read only the last few pages. Enough to know it was private, but not secret, and he wrote it for understanding, not for prying. They sat a while longer. The sun moved behind the apple tree, casting dappled shade across the grass. A butterfly, pale yellow, settled briefly on the edge of the blanket Miss Marple had been knitting, its wings opening and closing like slow breathing. When Mrs. Langford rose to leave, she paused at the gate. We're planting roses along the south wall this autumn, she said. White ones, the kind he liked. Thought you might like to know. Miss Marple smiled. I shall look forward to seeing them. That evening she sat by her window with the notebook open on her lap. She did not reread every entry, only turned the pages slowly, letting the dates pass beneath her fingers like days themselves. When she reached the final one, she paused, and then closed the book and placed it on the small table beside her chair, next to the white wool and the half-finished blanket. Outside, the village quieted. Lights appeared in windows along the lane. The church clock struck 9, clear and unhurried. Somewhere farther off in the tall brick house, a different clock remained forever at 12 minutes past 12. Miss Marple picked up her needles again. The shell stitch grew row by row, each loop a small, deliberate act of continuation. She thought, not with sadness but with quiet satisfaction, that Horace Pendleton had achieved something very rare. He had said goodbye to his burdens on his own terms, in his own time, and left behind a trail of small clarities for those who came after. The baby blanket would be finished by August, the roses would bloom next summer, and the notebook would rest on her shelf, read perhaps by no one else but present, like the memory of a chime that had sounded perfectly once, and then stopped forever. She worked on until the light failed, then folded the knitting, banked the fire, and climbed the stairs. In her bedroom, she set the notebook on the dressing table beside her spectacles. Moonlight came through the gap in the curtains, silver and calm. Everything, she thought, had found its proper place. The night deepened. St. Mary Mead slept, and somewhere in the gentle silence between one year and the next, a very old clock and one very precise old gentleman rested completely. Chapter 10. Echoes in the Quiet. By the autumn of 1927, St. Mary Mead had entered that golden season when the light turns honey-colored in the late afternoons and every leaf seems to hold its breath before falling. The lime trees along the lane were heavy with russet and amber. The churchyard grass had grown thick and soft underfoot. Miss Marple, now moving a fraction more slowly than the year before, still walked the same paths each day. Her coat was the same wool one with the velvet collar, though she had added a thin silk scarf in pale lavender, cut from the very last remnant of the wool she had used for Mr. Pendleton's shawl 2 winters earlier. One crisp October morning she received a small parcel delivered by the postman himself. It was wrapped in plain brown paper tied with string and addressed in a careful, unfamiliar hand. Inside lay a single object, a brass clock key, and we came across this while clearing out the tall brick house. Attached was a short note on thick cream notepaper. Dear Miss Marple, we came across this while clearing out the hall cupboard last week. My husband remembered you speaking of Mr. Pendleton's clock and thought you might like to have it. It has not been used since he put it away that New Year's morning in 1926. We have kept the clock silent as he wished, but felt this small piece belonged with someone who understood its meaning. With kind regards, Eleanor Langford. Miss Marple held the key in her palm for a long moment. It was heavier than it looked, cool against her skin, the grooves still sharp from years of turning, and she placed it carefully on the mantelpiece beside the small notebook Horace Pendleton had left behind. The one she now opened from time to time, not to read every word but simply to let the dates pass under her fingers like beads on a rosary. That afternoon she walked to the churchyard. The forget-me-nots had spread farther this year, forming a gentle blue halo around the headstone. Someone, perhaps one of the Langfords, perhaps a child from the village, had placed a single white rosebud there that morning. It was still tightly furled, waiting for tomorrow's sun. Miss Marple stood quietly, letting the breeze move the scarf at her throat. She did not speak aloud. There was no need. The story had long since settled into the village like dust after a long day, not a mystery anymore, and but a small parable about how a man could choose the moment of his own peace. People sometimes smiled when they passed the tall brick house now. Not out of melancholy, but because they remembered the clock that had stopped exactly when its owner decided it should, and how that silence had somehow made the whole village feel a little more orderly. On her way home, she met Dr. Haydock coming the other direction. He raised his hat. "Afternoon, Miss Marple. Fine day for a walk." "Very fine," she agreed. "I've just been to the churchyard." He nodded. "I go there myself now and then. Not often. Just when I need reminding that most endings are quieter than we expect." They walked together a short distance. The doctor glanced sideways at her. "You've kept that key, I suppose?" She smiled faintly. "On the mantelpiece. A small reminder. Not to wind anything up again?" "Not unless someone truly needs it, wound," she answered. "Some things are meant to rest." He touched his hat again and continued on his way. Miss Marple watched him go, then turned toward her own gate. That evening she sat by the fire with her knitting. A pair of fingerless mittens now, dark green wool for the new young postman who had taken over the round. The wireless played softly in the background, a piano recital from London, slow and thoughtful. Every so often she glanced at the brass key on the mantelpiece. It caught the firelight and threw a tiny golden spark across the room. Later, when the recital ended and the house grew still, she rose and took the key down. She held it for a moment, then opened the small drawer in the side table where she kept oddments. Old receipts, and a few buttons, a length of ribbon. She placed the key inside, closed the drawer, and returned to her chair. The fire had burned down to embers. Outside, an owl called once from the direction of the church tower. Low, calm, untroubled. Miss Marple listened until the sound faded, then banked the fire for the night. She climbed the stairs slowly, pausing at the landing window to look out over the village. Lights still glowed in a few cottages. The tall brick house at the end of the lane showed only the soft outline of its roof against the stars. Somewhere inside it, a grandfather clock stood forever at 12 minutes past 12, its weights hanging motionless, its pendulum at rest. Miss Marple continued to her bedroom. She set her spectacles on the dressing table beside the green notebook, folded her scarf over the chair, and slipped beneath the eiderdown. The room smelled faintly of lavender from the sachets she kept in the drawers. As sleep began to gather around her, she thought, not for the first time, that the title Death on New Year's Night had never really been about an ending at all. It had been about a beginning. The beginning of quiet, the beginning of release, the beginning of a silence that allowed everything else to continue without strain. Horace Pendleton had not vanished on that midnight chime. He had simply stepped aside from his own burdens, letting them fall away like leaves in autumn, and then lived the last 6 days of his life as a man already free. The thought brought no sadness, only a gentle, steady warmth, like the last glow of a well-made fire. Miss Marple closed her eyes. The village breathed around her. Slow, even, peaceful. And the church clock struck 11, its deep note rolling across the rooftops and fading into the night. Somewhere far off in memory, 12 other chimes sounded once more. Perfect, final, kind. And then silence. Not empty silence, the best kind, the kind that holds everything that ever mattered. Good night, dear listener. The story rests now, complete and calm. Let it rest with you.